I was thinking transfer files.
Okay, let's, country's worst newspapers.
Once in a while, I'll get the post, especially the night like
They're not amused, I can tell.
But every once in a while, I'll get the post to the journal, or you might get both of them, or, you know. Sorry, Tyler's on his way.
Oh, no worries. You don't want anyone to miss anything.
If the first online version gets the original online, if somebody has it.
Yeah.
Just throw them in the titles, you can take the news.
At some point, it's not worth more trouble.
A lot of people believe, hence why they're having problems.
But, I've had to have it for, since I was like 15, reading the paper, it's hard to break.
All right, I've got audio, and then Tyler's gonna come over and help with the public comment. So you can
Go ahead.
Sorry, yep, sorry about that.
Okay,
Okay, so
with that pause here, we'll get into the next item, which is approval of agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? We only have that one item, the downtown development precursor changes under general business. So seeing no request for changes, we'll move on to approval of minutes. We've all had a chance to look at the tape or read or both the synopsis of the minutes. Any comments, changes, corrections, or do we have a motion?
I move to approve based on the clerk certification December 9, 2019 minutes of Littleton Planning Commission.
Second.
You get that? Who's taking minutes here?
Let's see. I did not get who made the motion or.
We'll wait for the tape. Ron and second was Bruce. Although, sorry, we don't have any switches. All those in favor of approval, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So we have what, 6, 7 here? 1, 2, 3, 7.
Any abstentions?
Any abstentions? No, we had 7 approvals. Okay. Next item is public comment. If you wish to address the planning commission on any issue, and any issue tonight, since we have no public hearing, you'll have 3 minutes to speak. Somebody's got a,
I do have a watch, although
Got a
We didn't have time.
Use your cell phone.
Mrs. Chadbourne would like to do a video presentation or an overhead, and Tyler should be here momentarily to.
We've got it.
Oh,
ready to go.
almost.
IT's not gonna like
The
it.
3 files start with Littleton downtown.
We have training about finding the suspicious
If
flash
we're all there,
drive
I can.
in the parking lot and plug it into.
She did.
One could go
This is
longer.
my USB.
Not hers.
Calling Ashley, our IT director.
So you have to pass the slides to this right here.
What do they have for Veteran Information Services?
Okay, ready to go?
Ready when you are.
3 minutes starts now.
So I'm Pam Chadbourne, I live in downtown Littleton and hence my interest in the downtown precursor. I do want to thank you all, staff, for preparing and you all for considering the 2 moratoriums for downtown, and I hope you consider those or even stricter moratoriums. It's good to see some of the proposed changes. I'm going to point out that some were in the previous downtown design standards and guidelines and the comprehensive plan. And so oddly, we're going back to restore things that we had before. And that's a problem. I think those would not have allowed about half of the new infill redevelopments that were made by Planning Commission by blessing applications in violation of our current comp plan and downtown standards and guidelines at the time. What we really need to do is go back and look at those documents and say what were their strengths and weaknesses and what do we need to fix, including the definition of a more specific criteria for quality design. What does quality design mean? If you guys had fixed that, that actually would have taken care of 80% of the violations that we have. But that's why I'm mentioning it. The problem still exists and the resolution has to be, the process has to be fixed, not the documents. Just fix the parts of the documents that need fixing. And we learned from that. You guys have been on this board in one way or another, some of you for many years. You know this. You know the weaknesses and strengths of some of the parts of our documents that we had, and those are what we need to fix. So I want to say, we need a trade study on the boundaries of downtown, and if you look at the top of this document, thank you so much, Jen. I did this in 2011, and this is a proposal for height limits on downtown, but you'll notice I kind of went from Bellevue to ACC. In 2011, because that makes sense. And you know what, folks, we need to see trade studies for why the boundaries are what is in the current proposal and why not this. What would be best for Littleton? We need height limits for downtown, and I propose lower on the west and higher on the east. And the reason for that is we do have a right to a view. Municipalities have that power for a reason. And it's also false that there are no height limits in Littleton now. CA is constrained by the FAR. The parcel size combined with setbacks limit the heights of buildings that can be built on these parcels. Don't let anybody ever say again to you that there are no height limits. There are. We have the right to limit heights, and we should do that. And we've got to specify energy efficiency and design criteria that reduce energy consumption by new structures and allow solar access for warming and cooling positioning in the summer. So, and no displacement, no gentrification, and you've got to design a city for people who need public transit. So thanks, I obviously have more, and maybe I'll stick that in an email. Thanks very much.
Anyone else wish to speak? We have 3 other guests here. Guess not? Okay. Then we'll move on to our general business. This is ID number 20-014, Downtown Development Precursor Changes. Staff is going to give a PowerPoint presentation. Since this is a little more casual or informal, when you're giving the presentation, if we have some general questions as you go along, we're going to ask them. Technical questions, if you have them, we'll kind of wait till the end and then get into the nitty-gritty. So this is the opening salvo for the next year and a half to 2 years, rewriting, creating a new zoning code, zoning map, zoning use tables, the whole shebang, and then how does that relate to the comprehensive plan? So with that intro, take it away.
Excellent. So Mike and I are going to be tag teaming this evening and throughout this whole process. So bear with us as we do this, and we absolutely are open to comments and questions. Tonight, really what we had set out to do is kind of give you a summary of what we've done so far and where we're going to go, and the reason for we're calling these the precursor changes to the code update. The code rewrite will kick off in earnest on February 11th. And I'm trying to get KKC to actually be here that evening as well. So on the 10th, I believe we have that meeting. So over the past 6 weeks, I guess we are now, we have gone before council and basically asked for 10 precursor changes to the city code, 10 changes to the downtown design standards, and 8 administrative operational standards. Okay. At the last meeting, we actually, yes.
Just point of order, given this is a public meeting, I think we need a door open somewhere.
Excuse me, yeah, I heard the
I understand.
maintenance crew coming
No,
by,
I
so-
understand, but
Yep.
one or the other, I just don't think we can have them all closed.
Thank you.
That
Yeah,
makes sense.
Appreciate it.
Nope, that makes sense.
So the janitor's going down the
Should be able to get
with
what
the
we want.
wheels, you'll go out and
Yeah.
stop.
Yeah, right, thank you.
Want to open this one?
Whatever you want, I mean, whatever's, just
Trying
trying
to
to
close
be
that, and we'll open this.
Okay,
consistent with
I know.
how we've always, we should.
Legally speaking, it just needs to be unlocked, but consistent,
We
there's
tend
been a
to-
door open, sure.
Traditionally have had a door open on any of the public meetings.
And the council chamber door is open.
Yeah, so that would probably,
Come through.
that would satisfy that, for sure.
At the last city council meeting, we were given direction to enact those moratoriums. Those moratoriums are very specific to downtown, specific to residential development or development that contains more than one or more residential units. So this would affect anything that comes in as a mixed use that has a residential component as well as commercial, or any multifamily. So this does not touch single family development in downtown. The other moratorium, so there's two separate moratoriums. The other moratorium is in regards to a use specifically outlined in Exhibit A of that moratorium that we'll have that is auto-oriented. We also were given direction from council to lay out a series of study sessions at the timeline that'll be coming up in the presentation with an adoption of these revised precursor changes in May, being adopted by ordinance, and that would just apply to the city code where, as you recall, the design standards are a planning commission adoption and city council ratification. So city council doesn't take action except for ratifying, and then the administrative operational standards will be done administratively. So tonight's presentation, recap the study sessions, which I just did, so check that. And then really talking about how we did the analysis on the comp plan with the code and how we went about that analysis, discussing the downtown boundary, why we chose the boundary that we did, and then diving a little bit into the proposed changes to code design standards and operating standards, and what that impact will be on both current applications that we have in process and on past applications, how if we had had these precursor changes in place, how it would have changed some of the development that is downtown. And the timeline for changes kind of outline those city council study sessions as well as planning commission study sessions, and then the proposed schedule. So at this point, I'm going to turn over to Mike.
So over the past, and you may be aware of this, or many of you may be aware of it, maybe not, but over the past several years, staff has talked about different changes to the code that need to be made. And we've been kind of compiling a list of things that we'd like to see changed. Really in the past month though, we received direction from the city manager's office to move forward with some of these changes and others that can help the downtown area in particular as we transition from the old code to the new unified land development code, which will combine the zoning code, parts of the historical preservation code, and the subdivision code. As we looked at the downtown area with, I think there's 5 zone districts represented by downtown. There's really 5 different sets of regulations, 5 categories of land uses that are allowed in that area. We compared those to the 5 points of interest that council pointed out in their December 10th study session, which were public engagement, inconsistent allowed uses, lot development regulations, height, which is kind of part of lot development regulations, but it was highlighted by itself, and parking regulations. So we took those 5 and tried to compare them to the codes that we have downtown. So in doing that, if we switch forward, we looked at impacts on single family homes downtown, impacts on multifamily developments, and impacts on commercial developments. In addition, we looked at each policy and goal and tried to develop a matrix of how that fit into the character aspects of the comprehensive plan. Also, the standards, definitions, and practices used are the kind of the best practices used regionally. For example, an example of that is setback and how we measure setback. In this initial phase, we didn't want to look at, oh, hey, we need to look at the setbacks for all these 5 zoning districts and figure out what they really ought to be. No, that's coming up in that unified land use piece. The way we measure setbacks was a little bit unique. We would measure to the outermost point of the structure by our own code definition as it is right now. I don't think we did this consistently in the past, but the way our code reads, you measure to the outermost point of the structure, which would include the eave and things like that. That's not the way a lot of municipalities do it. A lot of municipalities will measure from the property line to the building wall.
Most, not
Most.
not a few, just most.
Most.
Most measure that way.
Yeah, and we used to hear about that all the time from the development community, and also property owners, people with houses downtown. We'd have to talk with lots of different groups, and they'd say, you gotta be kidding, you measure it to the eave? Well, there's an opportunity to correct that. So also, if you can forward it one, auto-oriented design is a big factor in the new comprehensive plan. And we tried to compare the types of uses that are allowed in the downtown area zoning districts and how those fit in. Also, walkability of site designs and how are we going to address those types of things. So staff spent a lot of time, particularly over the past month, but this has been building for a while, trying to analyze that, and that all eventually boiled down into the table that was included with your packet that I apologize was put on a million different pages. So we did put it in a handout, and then if anybody would like the handout in the audience, we can get more of those. So that's kind of how it all distilled down in the end, was we developed these 10 potential code changes, 10 potential design standards changes, and 8 potential operating standards, which are really administrative standards that deal with formatting of site development plans and some internal process things, or the operational standards. And I'll turn it back over. Nope, this is my slide too. One of the items brought up in the council study session, what is downtown? And that probably needs to be vetted a little bit more carefully in the future with the unified land,
We're just gonna call it ULUC.
ULUC.
Now we've said it enough, you guys
Unified
understand
Land
when we say
Development Code.
ULUC?
Yeah, what actually is the downtown area may be open to some discussion. For the purposes of this discussion tonight and for this, the regulations we're talking about, we stuck with the downtown design standards definition of the boundary of downtown. It is established right now. The downtown design standards apply to it already. This is sort of a way to bring in these, not interim regulations, but precursor regulations in a confined area that's, I think, somewhat agreed upon right now. But that discussion may come up again. I wouldn't be surprised if the idea came up again through the ULUC about what really is downtown. Does it include Lutheran Street or areas of Littleton Boulevard or things like that? That may be part of the discussion coming forward.
During the comp plan, there was talk about including the triangle to the west of Santa Fe and
Yes.
to the river.
Yes.
The undeveloped triangle portion.
Right.
It came up for discussion, didn't go anywhere, but
Yeah,
I mean, in the future, that could be.
in the future, in the near future, that could be part of the whole discussion.
I mean, you can set this up now, but hey, we can revisit it every year, every 2 years and change it.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and it will be revisited.
Versus 40 years typical Littleton, so.
Right. It'll be revisited here in the next 6 to 9 months as we focus on the downtown. That will be the first building block of the ULUC process.
But to start out, we thought, let's stay with this, easy to look at.
We
It
have to
also,
come up with a new name for that shape because it's not a football.
you know, that was mentioned at the last study session council.
Somebody
I
called it a
think Mayor,
cigarette lighter.
Yeah, the mayor called it a cigarette lighter, a Zippo or something like
We
that.
still
but-
call it a moated downtown. It's
Yeah.
got the moat.
Yeah.
It's in the
The football is still there, but.
Okay.
Yeah, so that fits the street signs that kind of look like the smoking cigarette, you know, with the little.
Oh, the smoking, there you go.
Cigarette lighter.
Cigarette or some other flammable substance.
What are those like pen dispenser, the Pez? The Pez, yeah, that's right.
dispenser.
Pez dispensers,
So that's why you removed ACC in the county building.
correct. Yeah, so.
Review.
Yes,
Okay.
I'll talk to this. So in doing our analysis, what we decided to do was kind of take a look at what has happened downtown in the last few years, and we found these kind of statistics pretty interesting. So there were 10 projects total built between 2004 and 2013. And then between 2014 and now, there have been 16 projects. So, and those are what are approved and built. We also have 5 projects that are currently pending building permit, and actually that's 6. We forgot to update
Correct.
that. And then 2 projects that are currently under planning review. And I think something that is important to note here is those 8 projects, the 6 under building permit and the 2 under planning review, those will not be affected by the moratorium. Those will continue to move forward because they're already in process. So the moratorium only affects applications that we receive from this point on.
Are they basically used by right projects at this point, or there's no other approvals required?
Correct. Correct.
So then they're looking for, height relief or setbacks or lot coverage relief.
We cannot require them to do any of that.
So, question, so the 2 projects currently under planning review, where is it in the review? Because I think the moratoria are
They're-
written in such a way so that if a site development plan has been approved, that's the cutoff, not going towards a site development plan.
So those are at the very end of the process. We've requested Mylars. They're practically through.
Okay.
So as Mike said, the proposed changes, this is how they break down in terms of the key conflict areas. With code changes in regards to public engagement, 6 having to do with development regulations, 1 having to do with parking, and 1 on allowed uses. And then the design standards, they are primarily focused on development regulations and parking. And then the operating standards are the public engagement and development regulations.
And these are basically outlined in the table. So each,
Blue
Right.
area represents the key conflicts.
yeah, the dark blue headers are 1 for each of the 3 areas, and then the light blue bands deal with each of the key areas: public engagement, development regulations, parking, and allowed uses. And that's consistent through all the tables. Some of the operating standards really don't deal with parking or allowed uses, but that is still part of the table at the very end, and it says not applicable.
So when we do a little exercise and having some of the precursor changes that we're proposing, of
Bruce had a question.
I'm sorry,
yeah.
you guys want questions on this document now, or do you wanna wait until you get further along?
If you don't mind, we're almost
Got a
done.
general question, but
No, it's
Specific,
it's
let's wait a
specific.
bit.
I'll wait. Yeah, thanks, appreciate it.
So when we apply some of these precursor changes, what we find of the 23 projects, 11 would still be approvable. They meet the standards. 2 would not be approvable due to building massing and step backs, that were not to be confused with setbacks. These are step backs, so building step backs. 4 would not be approvable because they wouldn't meet the direct access, that we'll be talking about. And 6 would not be approvable for both massing and access. Then the 2D moratoriums, again, I had described those, that more than one residential unit and then auto-oriented. And in particular, these are the uses that were listed in terms of auto-oriented.
when does the moratorium begin? When is it voted on?
It would technically be voted on for second reading on February 4th. However, there's what's called the pending ordinance doctrine, which can prohibit the acceptance of applications when a council is going to vote on certain land use type changes. The effect of which is so that there's not some rush to get something filed before the proverbial deadline, if you will.
It's basically in effect right now.
Effectively now,
Okay,
as those 2 are currently scheduled.
but officially the 90 days is early February.
It would be technically it actually would be from February 4th, because there is, when an ordinance goes into effect, there is a 7-day posting period, and then the republication takes a couple days, so effectively it's 9 days, so it would be going into effect on the 13th of February, technically. And going through that 90-day clock would be starting from then.
To midnight. So this is the proposed timeline that we have put together in terms of study sessions for Planning Commission. So we have the meeting that we're at tonight, which is kind of the introduction. And then the 27th, we're proposing to focus on the design standards. On the 10th, we're proposing to focus on the code changes. 224 would be focusing on the operating standards changes. And then 3.9, if we had any other things outstanding. And also on that 3.9, we would bring back any revisions that we had based on the conversations. Yes?
And so the 27th, there's a public meeting and then a study session. Is that how that?
That is what we're proposing, yes. So what we would do in that case, we would have the public meeting and then we would adjourn to take a 5-minute recess and adjourn to a study session over here.
This brings up a question, when we have our public hearing and we vote on this, we'll be voting piece by piece, or we're gonna be voting on the entire package? What's the intent?
I'll have legal weigh in, but I would say we probably need 3 separate votes because it's 3 different types of, because we'd have to have an ordinance for the code changes, we'd have to have a resolution for the design standards, and honestly, I don't think there's really a vote required for the operating standards.
Right, and technically for the design standards, that's typically not something that needs to go before council. I will tell you, before it did go before council, they ratified the vote of planning commission. So I would presume with a matter such as this, we would probably go by the same type of way. So obviously city code changes are brought for your recommendation regarding the changes, and then it's council who acts by way of ordinance, first and second reading, public hearing. Design standards are technically planning commission's action, but in the past, when we adopted the downtown standards, it went to planning commission and then ratified by city council, we would go that way. And for the operational standards, that is an administrative function that happens internally, but obviously both planning commission and council will be made aware of those, and presumably if there was heartburn over any sort of change, that those changes would be made to the changes prior to implementation of that.
I'm trying to figure out the end game here. We had, what, 20, 25 items or something. Let's say the ones that deal with the code. Are we going to, is that gonna be a code just for the former football? Or will we change the R5, CA, B2 areas in downtown? We'll change that rather than have an umbrella, let's say, code for just downtown.
So
What are we gonna do?
the code changes would generally affect the entire city of Littleton.
Correct.
And the design standards changes would be only applicable to the downtown area as defined in the design
But
standards.
the code, is your intent for the code items to change R5?
No,
No,
So it will be applicable just for the football.
correct.
So-
And then,
That's gonna be interesting
okay.
to set that up.
Well, just to clarify, the code changes that we're proposing are not specific to any specific zone district. Does that make sense? Like, it's not an R5 requirement that we're changing, like
Roof overhangs, yeah, okay,
it's general,
that's general,
it's
the way we
not
measure height.
specific, yeah.
yeah,
okay.
however, excuse
No.
me, you were, one code change that would affect the downtown area would be the requirement to have conditional uses for all auto-oriented uses. That would be a change to the land use table where we would refer to the downtown design standard area. And any auto-oriented uses, which would be specifically defined, would have to have a conditional use in the downtown area, but not in other B2 districts, not in other B3 or B1s, just that area covered by the downtown design standards. So that is the one exception.
So you're zeroing in just on downtown, you're not gonna be changing R5 for the entire city, B2 for the entire city,
That's correct.
okay? That's good, because it's so unique downtown, it needs its own set.
Well, and these precursor changes and the discussions we'll be having based on kind of building blocks, like focusing on downtown, focusing on mixed use, focusing on neighborhoods. These changes, as well as the discussion that occurs, may lead to an overlay district for downtown that would have a more
Good way to put
broad
it.
applicability. But that is part of that larger ULUC discussion that will occur. So in terms of city council study sessions, so the presentation we're giving you tonight is what we provided to city council last week. So tomorrow night we'll be starting and digging in with them on the design standards and focusing on the design standards. So anything that they bring up, we will then integrate into our next presentation to you on the design standards. 211 will be focusing on the code, and at that time, Brett Keast will actually be in town, and that's kind of gonna be our kickoff for the ULUC rewrite. We are, I'm trying to get him here as well for your meeting on the 10th. And there are also gonna be a series of public meetings, so I'm gonna need to be coordinating with you guys on some of them look to be overlapping with regular planning commission meetings and kind of getting your take if you would like to not have a regularly scheduled meeting, so you can attend the public meetings or how we wanna work that. So I will have that for you at our next meeting to discuss.
Will Kending Keast be presenting to us once or twice? I noticed they were presenting to council.
That is my hope, so I'm working with Kathleen and Brett on that now.
What is your outreach gonna be for the public? We'll start with the public, but then what's your outreach gonna be to business owners, property owners, the design community, the developer community? Are you going out and soliciting their comments, or is it
On
just
the
internal, just
precursor-
us?
On the precursor changes?
Yes, precursor.
We will most likely use our typical bespoke format of Littleton plans, kind of putting it out on Littleton plans and seeking input on that in that platform. So I do not, with these precursor changes, envision us having public meetings on them.
General questions? Fire away. Come on, I've got a whole list of them. No one else?
I'm gonna make a few copies.
We borrow yours.
Well, you can take this, I don't need it.
Oh,
You
that's
got- you got
fine.
enough?
Yeah, this is clean. Yeah, I'll be right back.
Well, is there, I noticed that there's a possibility of doing a fiscal impact analysis if needed. In my mind, it has to be done. There are some pretty big fiscal impacts here on some of these items, like the introduction of a bulk plane. That's not small potatoes. Extra parking spaces, needed, but it's not small potatoes. That's quite an impact. The question is, a friend of mine brought this up, and I'll bring it up. Is there gonna be a legal impact analysis done for what we're proposing here? I assume there's some legal ramifications for perhaps takings or what have you. Are we gonna have that type of presentation? That would be interesting. Maybe we have none. Maybe there are some dangers, potential liabilities. It'd be nice to know about it.
And you wanna keep those.
I'm sorry?
I'm like, okay.
Let's see,
You know, as far as the takings question, unless you're gonna deprive a property owner of any real use of their property, the chances of being successful in a takings action against a governmental entity is pretty slim.
okay. Your analysis might be, 3 minutes long, or
Done.
as we're going.
10
Done. Or as we're going through this, if something arises, it'd be nice to have your input.
Understood.
Okay, that's my point. I noticed there was some alluding to the P4 process changing. I think council requested that. Do we really wanna, maybe we can slip that in, we got a lot of work for the next month and a half, 2 months here.
And that was my question to you. I mean, is that, I can tell you that we have had developers come to us asking basically for that process to change in terms of giving them the ability to answer questions during that P4 process. Maybe not necessarily to present, it would still be staff presenting, but just have the ability to be available to either ask questions or respond to questions. Because right now that is not in the process. And is the P4 process in our ordinance? Any idea? I mean, so.
I didn't hear your.
No, the P4 process.
Is it in our what
Code.
code?
So I mean, is that something you would wanna consider at this time? It definitely will be addressed in the larger rewrite, but I mean, there are some larger developments on the immediate horizon that I think could benefit from a more conversational P4 process.
Yeah, I like it, I like the process, I mean, but there was apparently some proposed changes, do you know what those
That's what she's
changes?
talking about.
What other,
Yeah,
that's
but
what
what
she
other
just said.
changes? Specifically?
Yeah,
Their conversation
changes
with us.
specifically that it would allow an applicant to
Okay, they allow the
ask
applicant,
questions or respond to questions, because right now,
rather than just listening,
correct.
got it, okay.
You have Marjane as optional, so there is potential.
Okay.
If it, I would guess it would depend on how long our discussions are, but it would be good to put it in there.
Okay, and I anticipate on the operating standards side, because those are more an administrative thing, that will be a shorter conversation.
So maybe a time at that point to start in on that if we don't have carryover from the other ones.
Next is the accessory, it was talk about including the accessory dwelling units in discussion?
No.
I did see it, but it's gone now?
So it is more, that conversation is more about short-term rentals, not ADUs.
Okay, short-term rentals.
But just short-term rentals, I know some proposed changes were made to short-term rentals, they weren't really vetted with planning commission or the public. And more like what's our timeframe and stomach for bringing that forward sooner than the ULUC.
Those were subject to moratorium also. Did that moratorium expire?
Yes.
So it's, right now it's free for all.
Right now, they get a business license.
What?
They are required to get a business license.
Is it your intent though to include that in this next 2-month period?
It is a possibility.
There's just been, 6-8 months on it, never went in a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, pro, con, never went anywhere. We're gonna try to sneak it in a 2-month process. That
To be
might-
fair, you got a new council too.
Yeah.
So
In speaking with our council, I know there is interest in addressing ADUs. I know there is interest in short-term rentals, so I know that's on the horizon. Is that something that's gonna be fixed with these code changes, design standards and operating standards? No, that's not gonna be part of that. I think that, as you know, probably from the prior process, it involves kind of a larger discussion. So it's on the roadmap going forward as we go through the code changes, whether that comes up sooner rather than later. I think that's an interest of our council, but not for this interim temporary moratorium period. I don't think that there's the capacity to get that work done and that conversation to be had,
Not completed in 8
not
weeks,
completed.
but it may become a conversation
It-
that starts up
Oh, it's
in
coming,
these
yeah.
next 8 weeks.
My point is it really shouldn't be part of this 2-month period.
I mean, ADU is probably gonna take more than the short-term rental conversation, I would guess
Yes, oh,
too.
for sure, yes.
Yeah, and I mean, yes, accessory structures is in there, and that's more just clarifying what an accessory structure is, not an ADU conversation. That is not happening in the next 2 weeks, in the next 8 weeks.
I'm doing one and I'm still confused every time I talk to the city, so it's tough, it's not quite clear. I'm crossing my fingers when I proceed with the design. My last comment is for the next presentations here, when you start getting into the code changes or when you're talking about bulk plane or setbacks, what have you, I think it's imperative that you have drawings rather than just waving your hand and having written material. Just a very simple 8.5 by 11 or projected on the screen, a drawing of what you're proposing. What does it look like? Cross section through the site. What does a bulk plane mean? So people can understand it. I mean, a couple of these topics are quite confusing and difficult.
Yes, no, I agree. We've actually already put together that PowerPoint presentation for council. So if you wanna take a look tomorrow, if there's things that you feel like would be beneficial to add, please let me know.
Yes, okay.
I'm unfamiliar with that term.
Bulk plane?
Yeah, can someone define it in general?
It's more building that.
Give it a shot.
Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely get into it when we do the design standards, but it's just kind of the massing, and we're really focusing on stepping back buildings, so you don't have necessarily like a bungalow next to a 40-foot wall, but it has to start stepping back.
Okay, basically the building as it goes up has to go in.
Yeah,
The classic example that was built to a bulk plane is the Empire State Building. It starts off as a big block and as it goes up, it gets narrower as it goes higher.
Okay.
Look, like in Denver for a 50-foot wide lot, bulk plane is right in the middle of the site, basically. On the side setback, you draw a line 17 feet up in the air at the side property line, then you do a 45-degree angle. That building envelope has to stay within that bulk plane, except for roof overhangs, chimneys and a few other minor items. But, so that's basically it keeps the buildings lower and, you know, you're stepping them back or you've got a sloping roof that keeps it. So you're not going bulky, you're not doing a 30-foot high wall on the side of your property.
Yeah, okay.
I think that's
Denver
one of the mixed
zoning.
use, that where they did the steps, that has.
There's great
Denver has
illustrations
a-
in Denver zoning
Denver has
code.
a tip sheet explaining that. I just looked it up a while ago, so I didn't know what it was. I could send
We'll
that
just copy
to
that.
everybody.
So, but that's the kind of thing where, you know, writing about it or waving hands would be impossible. You've gotta have a drawing, whatever you propose.
Yeah, and right now, our zoning code, it's difficult to have illustrations in the zoning code. But the design standards, it's easy to put illustrations in there. And as we go through the ULUC process, we may get it so we can have more figures and illustrations in the code itself.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
You'd be crazy not to. I mean,
Yeah.
all this writing, when a simple drawing, if you keep it simple, unlike Denver, keep it simple, it's easy to understand if you just have a picture. You wanted to get into specifics, anybody have any general comments? If you wanna go into some specifics, we can do it now. Although we're gonna have, 3 more sessions, maybe 4, to go over each section in detail.
I did want to say, some of us here were involved in the 2011 downtown neighborhood plan. And one of the things I recall in that, and revisiting the document itself, was that there were a lot of test cases that we did. In fact, I think staff took a number of the sites, especially in the R5 zoning area, to see how, as of right, CA or other R5 could play out as a maximum development scenario. So I think that may be helpful too, to do some test cases, especially in a small, relatively small area as downtown. And one thing I think we could reflect on is how, you know, developing that with public engagement, there's a pretty robust process. It took, 4 years, I think, to put the neighborhood plan together, a lot of discussion and so on. And it doesn't seem to have worked, at least to the full extent that we envisioned it, in terms of preserving the character of that old, I think it's called Old Downtown neighborhood, the single-family residential. And the diagrams you put together are really helpful, I think, as far as analyzing what's happened since then, in terms of, you know, what was there and what's there now, what's planned for there now. And I don't think that's what we envisioned, you know, back in 2011.
The problem being, you still had the old zoning code with, you know, CA uses by right and you know, whatever, no height limit, minimum, or no setbacks in certain areas. And they're clashing with the document from 2011.
So the neighborhood plan provided another tool for staff
Yeah.
and planning commission and council to review development applications, but it doesn't seem like it was applied in the manner that it was intended. So I think with the new zoning regs that we're talking about now, perhaps it has quite a bit more teeth that will allow it to, you know, I think that comparison of, you know, roughly half of what's been built or proposed wouldn't pass muster with the current guidelines or standards. Suggests that maybe we'll be able to do better, but I just hate to, you know, put that effort in again and not be able to see.
And we put the effort into the, you know, just 3 or 4 years ago, the downtown design guidelines and standards. And then last year, we said, oh, wait a second, guidelines aren't working, we made it all standards. But that whole process, we didn't get into policy. So if we ran into a policy issue like decreasing heights or increasing car, we didn't get into that. We were a citizen, a group of people. Our charge wasn't to change policy, that was left for now, for the future, and that now the future is now. We put it off, but yeah, it somewhat failed as well. That's why, you know, going from guidelines and standards to standards, and now we're going into it again. And we'll probably get into it again 5 years from now, as we find out what the flaws are.
And I think that was the intent of the Littleton downtown design standards, is to change over time, is what I hear. And we've had several good years of experience with it, and now we've got some suggested changes that might help correct the course slightly, but none of the effort was wasted, and I don't think there were any failures in that. But we just need a little bit of a course correction based on our experience.
I'd also like to second Mark's opinion that we would need some sort of fiscal and legal framework to be working within. I think that guidance is gonna be important in terms of really what are our goals for downtown? What do we want it to be? Not just us, but folks that live in Littleton. What's the mix of affordable housing and unaffordable?
And those are all, I mean, the conversations and that bigger impact analysis is gonna happen with the ULUC rewrite. I mean, we really, so, as we start to dig deeper on some of these, if we decide that this is a much bigger conversation, there's nothing saying we have to make that change now. But, so that's gonna be part of the conversation too, is this a bigger conversation and we shouldn't touch this right now? Or is this something that, yes, this will have a good impact, is legally acceptable, is economically acceptable, and we can move forward at this time with it.
What would really be interesting is, right now our zoning code is just about as dry as you can get. It's R1, R2, R3, R5, B1, B2, blah, 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 CA, boom, 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 a half a page each, amazingly simple and quite confusing and nebulous in so many areas, as you have found out. So it'd be interesting to see how that changes, but then how does what we're doing right now, how does that fold into that code? Is it a separate little section of its own that's, it has to be if we're having standards just for that football. It'd be interesting to see how it all comes together a year and a half, 2 years from now.
The idea is we're not going to do a patchwork with our current code. We're not gonna, right now these precursor changes are one thing, but as we go to the Unified Land Development Code, it's not going to be, hey, we're gonna change items here and we're gonna rethink the entire code. Yeah.
Patchwork is all we've been doing for the last
40 years.
30, 40 years.
Right. So it'll be a very different effort than that.
So embrace this process, this is the last patchwork we're doing.
Unintended consequences is what I always bring up.
Yeah, this is addressing all the loopholes that have been found.
Yeah, architects are famous for finding weaseling loopholes.
You said it, not me. No. I think you did. So, Bruce, yes.
This was sort of a specific item that, the more I think about it, turns maybe into a general item. It's in your spreadsheet here under I guess it's the third page, it's downtown phase 1, downtown design standard changes.
Yes.
It's number 1 is facade requirements. And it's under the impact column for developers, it says encourages reinvestment over redevelopment. So that's a nuanced attribute in and of itself, but the more I sat here and was staring at it, it almost strikes me as an historic preservation attribute. And I don't know, I guess I'm asking, what is the policy orientation of this? Are we looking at facade retention, pretty much carte blanche, throw over all the downtown cigarette lighter? Or or, I mean, at what point in time does redevelopment make sense for any particular parcel? I mean, if the building, I mean, I get historic preservation, if you know, there's value there, but if at some level, it may make sense to redevelop a property. And I guess I'm trying to gauge where we are in terms of the policy orientation here. Are we giving preference to one, you know, to quote unquote reinvestment over redevelopment, or help me interpret this?
Do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure, that's a great question, Commissioner Stallman. I think right now we've seen, or with several developments we've seen downtown, they take one lot and where one house was, and try and maximize the number of units they can get on there. And you're usually looking at about 6 units or 5-6 units approximately on one lot. And that I think would be the proposed changes really would encourage more multi-lot development. If you wanted to maximize the number of units on a development site, it would probably encourage a landowner to look at more than one lot to do that. So on the single lot, we think it might sort of encourage some reinvestment in the lot as to, on a single lot, I could maybe do more by doing a duplex or a possibly a single family home on that single lot.
Okay.
Whereas, if you're really looking to maximize things, you probably need to get more than one lot. So I'm not sure that we captured that very well in the phrase encourages reinvestment over redevelopment. But I think that was the general thought of the facade changes. Some of them include, and we'll get into the details of this, but some of them include making sure that the main facade is the predominant frontage of a lot. On some of these 6-unit developments, the access drive can be the predominant feature of the lot that takes over the majority of the lot. So we've suggested a couple changes in the design standards to maybe remedy that. Also, we'd struggle with doors. Yeah, right now the design standards require that more than one primary door be on the front facade, so that you don't have a house that or a apartment building that faces sideways, essentially a slot home, as it were. Well, we've strengthened that a little bit to make sure that you could have a front door on the a front facing door on the front facade, and then 50 feet back, you can have this little front door that faces the street and it still meets our current design standards. Well, this would change it so that door's gotta be right up front. So that second door. So we're hoping that can address some of the tighter development, it's when a single lot comes in, everything's super tight on the site, and there's not a lot of room to play with the different standards and that type of thing. But this would probably encourage more multi-lot developments if you really wanted to build a larger development. You need more than one lot.
Okay.
How's that for a long-winded answer?
I appreciate the flavor, because, that helps.
Okay.
I think that's an improvement.
Can I ask another question right along with that question is, I see you don't have single family checked off in one, because we probably won't have a lot of single family going in downtown, but I don't know, is that already a requirement for single family housing, or is it going to be at all in the slim chance there might be a single family home new come in downtown? I'm just wondering why that's excluded.
Well, so the design standards do cover single-family development, the design standards themselves. And we were looking at, the changes and how they might impact either multifamily, single-family, or commercial. So in our estimation, we've done sort of a checklist of that on the right-hand side, and we will kind of explore that in greater detail, but we wanted to kind of give that flavor to both the commission and the city council of, hey, what, as you're looking at these individual regulations, are they affecting single-family development pretty significantly? Are they just affecting commercial development? Are they affecting all three? We wanted to give you an idea of that with each regulation. So where the greatest impact was. So you can kind of make decisions, or you can give us input as we go through. And if you don't like how something affects commercial development, we may be able to change it so that it has less of an impact on commercial development as we kind of attack the details of this.
So for
That
a single family home, the way it reads now is that at least some of the front doors have to, so if you're only a single family home, then your front door has to face, because you only have one to deal with. So that's why we didn't feel like it impacted single family.
Gosh, she answered it in 2 sentences.
I think, I like some of these changes, and some of them are really relevant. They just came up at our last meeting, like the notification of residents. Potential downside to that is if you happen to touch a 600-unit apartment complex, that's a lot of postcards to mail, but it would definitely increase notification. Someone had mentioned earlier wanting to see pictures. I'd really love to see pictures, and I think you brought up the idea of, a single lot might be hard to develop. Well, let's find out how hard it is once you take into account 20% open space. I mean, can you fit a duplex on a 6,000 square foot lot? Can you fit a triplex on there?
Somebody here used test case,
Yeah,
let's see some
yeah.
test cases, we're arguing,
Yeah,
item 15.
and I picked 6,000 square feet because I found there was a parking lot downtown, so basically a vacant lot that was, roughly 6,000 square feet. And, so whatever the typical lot size is for the downtown area. And then, some of the parking standards, I'd be very interested as we get further into the process to see what the data is. The 2019 Institute for Traffic Engineering, or engineers parking generation manual, which is a manual where engineers go out and sample parking utilization. So this is, rock solid data, says that if you're within a half mile of a light rail station, you have lower parking demand. So is what we're proposing in line with the ITE recommendations for development and parking near light rail stations? And, one thing I'm also be curious to know about as we're getting further into this is how requiring more auto-focused use, i.e. parking, limits the potential for auto-oriented design. Because it seems like by definition, we're adding more space for autos to the downtown area if we're adding parking requirements.
You obviously have to control the access and where it is.
Yeah, and actually talking of access, one thing I'm curious about is whether the downtown standards have any sort of maximum driveway width for curb cuts. Because that's something that can really interrupt the pedestrian accessibility in a downtown area. And there are some communities that say, if you have alleys, you shall take access off the alleys, no curb cut for you. I don't know if we want to go that far as a community, but limiting the width of driveways could be something that we consider.
thought our downtown design standards did encourage the use of alleys rather than.
Or share.
Yeah, and
If you
I don't have them
got it.
memorized.
It does do that, but
Yeah.
it's not necessarily about the size as you were
Right.
talking about. They do talk about wanting to be shared
Right.
and minimizing them.
If I, wanted to build a single family home downtown, I put the door at the front and then have a 3-car garage and a massive driveway. It's unlikely, but
I don't think the standards would be, that doesn't fit the standards.
yeah.
Well,
There was a I'm sorry, I
No.
didn't mean to interrupt. There was a development downtown, that it's a duplex, I believe, that, developed under the design guidelines that had 2 double garage doors right in front. The same developer wanted to develop across the street, after the standards were adopted and was not allowed to do that same design where the 2 garage doors were facing the street, the 2 doubles. So there have been some good effects of making them design standards in regards to the street frontage and the curb cuts and things like that.
No, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Denver has a regulation of if there's no alley, if it's front-loaded garage, it can only be a certain percentage of the facade width. I don't know what the percentage is, but it does cut out the, massive 3-car garage and a little peewee door. And, it's a garage masquerading as a house or something like that.
We used to call them garage proud.
Yeah. You have all that stuff. Thanks.
Keep going, anybody else?
I have a question where it talks about, you guys talk about how Kenning and Keast put together a post-adoption memo that outlines the high priority areas. So areas, more than one, so is something like perhaps the corridors or something. When this is done, would be moving on to perhaps another high priority area, or that will just be folded in when it would ever be got to when the code was updated?
You know what, that's a great question. And I think, if we, as we go through this process, have other areas of the city that we feel like we need to adopt some changes until we get to the end. This is the entire rewrite. We're looking at an 18-month process. So if we get into a building block such as mixed use or corridors or something and see things right off the bat that we need to address immediately, we could end up going through this process again. I don't foresee it being as concerning as downtown.
I just wondered, because the corridors have come up quite a lot, especially like Santa Fe, where you're talking about different sections having a different flavor. And if that's left towards the end, that could destroy the idea of different sections having the different flavor. They've talked also about Littleton Boulevard and Broadway, potential for all those too, so.
Right. Those are the 3 corridors that we'll be looking at. So, at our next meeting, we should have the finalized scope from KKC and the timeline. So I think that'll start to address or
So that
answer some
depending
of
on
those
where
questions.
they might fall within that timeline. And so is the idea as the code is going on, if it's earlier in the timeline, is that something that would be adopted? Or would it all be adopted at the end?
That's yet to be determined. I think it again depends on the urgency.
Thanks.
I would hope that we wouldn't have so many special areas that it just makes the code more complicated. Hopefully, we can, R3 is R3, R1 is R1. We don't have a R1-2A like Denver, and then you get it, it gets just so cumbersome, it's nuts.
Well, and I think those are all, again, part of the discussions that need to be had while we're going through this process.
Yeah.
Of, and talking with developers. You talked about, are we reaching out to developers? Are we, reaching out to, but we will be doing all of that in the ULUC process.
Not gonna do too much of it here, we don't have much time in the next 2 months, but the long, I'm thinking,
long game
the
is
long
worth a
term,
lot
I'm
more.
thinking about the end game, what we're looking at.
As long as it protects the city from what the community wants.
Good.
I mean, it's
General,
nice to have
yes.
uniform And Littleton has uniqueness and we don't want to lose it.
I can tell you right now, like, we're pretty much straight Euclidean zoning, I mean, you're talking about that. And then there's form-based zoning, we're gonna fall somewhere in between.
Any general comments here? Sorry to ask one other, one more.
It's just you and the football game at this point, so.
I just got kicked under the table. I see somebody's cell phone's got the game on, but no, just one. Let's say, okay, downtown.
Yes.
You establish right now, the R5 area of downtown is 43.56 units per acre, something like that, pretty close. You do this over, let's call it the overlay. Will the R5 of downtown go away, or will there still be an R5 zoning district as there is today for downtown?
I cannot answer that. It will
You could
depend on
really
the
change.
discussion that happens.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of just organizational things that's gonna be potential bugaboo here. Okay, and of course, the danger is it just gets to be a cumbersome, massive document that nobody can understand, worse than what we have today, so.
As the people that have to implement it,
Yes.
we will prevent that as much as possible.
Yeah, you can probably expect all the zoning districts to align with the future land use and character map is what I'm expecting, but that we would, those zoning districts would look very much like the future land use and character map.
Just like the future land use map looks like pretty close to the existing zoning map. It's almost spot on. It's very little difference.
I just have a comment.
Yeah.
And that I thought your presentation, the level, the quality is really high. It was excellent, and that you've really upped your game on your handouts and presentation format, so kudos for that.
Thank you.
Except for, the little email faux pas.
Yeah, we didn't have control over that, so sorry about that. That's not how it got sent, so.
Okay.
Yes, we'll make sure that does not happen again. I'm sorry I didn't pick that up until today.
Notice we don't do our homework till the last minute, so we could tell you.
No, I mean, this is a heavy lift. And I fully acknowledge that and thanking you in advance for the time that this is gonna take over the next 18 months. Not even just these next 8 weeks, but the time that it's gonna take, and I appreciate all of your input on that, and we will reach consensus on what should go in the code, but I know there will be lots of discussion on that, so thank you in advance for your time.
We're here, we spent a lot of time, year and a half on the comprehensive plan and the transportation plan, and after that was approved, it kind of was a tired, crash and burn, but personally, I'm ready to go. It's kind of boring without
We laid
meetings
off
every 2
you
weeks.
enough that we can put it back on now, put the pressure back on.
Yeah, let's get going. This is, we should have done this 20 years ago. Downtown would look a lot different than it looks today if we'd done it 20 years ago.
I agree with Mark, I think we sort of signed up for both. The comprehensive plan needed to happen. This is part and parcel of that whole exercise, and so I think we're all excited to move forward, keep progress occurring.
If there's nothing else, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Get the second half. Okay, adjourned.
Yeah.